Present History podcast. We have a very special episode today as we are with Dr. George Severs, a leading oral historian specialising in the history of activism, sexuality, religion and work, a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, and a member of the Editorial Board of Oral History, the journal of the UK's Oral History Society. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's a pleasure and an honour to have you here.
Thanks very much for asking me. It's a real delight to be able to speak to you about it.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing oral history on this episode, the power of oral history and kind of what oral history is. But before we do, would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, about your background, what kind of brought you into history?
Yeah, I don't really remember a time where I didn't want to do history or something historical. When I was very young, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I suppose the more I learnt about history and kind of modern contemporary history, the more I was pulled from the very ancient to the very modern. Right. But I suppose, like many people, was kind of fascinated listening. I was very, very fortunate to have great grandparents who I knew for quite a long time before they died, and was always fascinated to sit and listen to my kind of great grandfather talking about his time during the war, and then my great grandmother telling me stories about kind of like life on the home front, and wow. that was kind of really invigorating for me as a young person, and made doing history lessons at school really, I was always very keen to be part of those conversations, and was always really looked forward to that. So I don't remember a time where I didn't want to do history. That was always kind of on my agenda, and I'm very fortunate in having known that, and that I always wanted that. I don't know. I don't have a sense of when I knew that you could do a PhD or that you could do history, right, as and I won't say for a living, for kind of pertinent contemporary reasons, but that you could do it full time, right? Yeah. That could be something you would do. But I do know that was what I've wanted to do for quite a long time. So I always just there were always next stages. So I did my GCSE and picked history as a subject, and the same for A level, and then came here where we're sat now. I was an undergraduate at Royal Holloway almost 10 years ago, and that really I suppose cemented certain interests I had, and I think somewhere in between being an A-level student and being an undergraduate was where I feel I really learned to be a historian, and that's really where I became a contemporary historian. Yeah,
it's similar for me as well. I've always just loved history, and it's always been around. But it's interesting that you mentioned that stories were a large part of what drew you to history, and I guess that's very much what is the realm of oral history as well, are those stories and finding those stories. And so with oral history in particular, how did you kind of get into that? Was it always an interest for you, the storytelling aspect of it, or was there a moment where you realized I want to get into oral history? Yeah,
that's really interesting. It's something I've only reflected on quite recently, that there has been this kind of long background of interest in stories and interest in listening, not necessarily rather than reading, but it struck me recently that I always used to really prefer listening to the audio books of horrible histories rather than actually reading them. I've always had kind of history sounds on, if you like. There's always, but I hadn't really reflected on that, because when I came to Holloway, I remember the route into oral history for me was through Graham Smith, who is an oral historian, and who at the time was, I think, still the chair of the Oral History Society, but he was certainly at Royal Holloway, and he was the department's oral historian. Right. And he gave a lecture in my, I suppose, first or second year, that was kind of, approaches to history, and you get people come and, it's one of those very broad, you probably took a similar course, Zach, very broad thing. And in those days, it would be something from Nigel Soule talking about medieval manuscripts all the way up to Graham Smith talking about actually speaking to people about their real experiences. But I very much wasn't sold straight away. This is going to get me kicked out of the Oral History Society now, but I wasn't sold, and I think I don't really remember why, but I think I certainly have. I was really struck by that because when I'm fast forwarding here, but when I did eventually take Graham's course as a third year, and that was the same year that the third edition of the Oral History Reader, which remains our kind of Bible for oral history literature, somewhere in there, I forget which article it is, but I've got written as a kind of smarmy third year undergraduate, or maybe earlier, something about like accuracy ?
Right.
And I remember. I may be misremembering this actually. I think that was an earlier period, but I certainly had those thoughts about like, how can we really know this is true, or I had those kind of concerns that we know are real concerns of detractors of oral history. Yeah. How can we know this is true? Is this story accurate, etc., etc. So that was kind of going on at some point, and I guess there are kind of competing. There are various methodologies and kind of historical modes of inquiry that vie for your attention when you're doing loads of different courses. But what actually got me over the line and what got me kind of invested and interested is again relatively circuitous, but I had done in my second year a project with Andrea Mamone on fascism, and I was really interested in British cultures of fascism, and I'd written my kind of piece for that was about the kind of anti-gay sentiment that's really active in the British far right in the 80s and the 90s. And I've since published that. That's an article that came out in Gender and Education. And I was really invested in this, so I felt really, I was very interested in it, and there was clearly more to do. I think there is more to do, and I'm sure people are doing it now, but I really wanted that to be my undergrad dissertation, and I asked around, and at the time the head of department was Jonathan Phillips, and was like, where is the kind of LGBT history that we can do? And there basically wasn't any.
Right.
But someone suggested, why don't you do Graham's course, which was new that year, which was oral history of British health and medicine, and they said, because one of the sections in that article about the far right is about the AIDS crisis,
right,
and how the far right kind of latch on to the AIDS crisis as a convenient political football for already existing anti-gay politics. And someone said, why don't you do this course and write some more about the AIDS crisis? And I thought that sounded like a good idea. I did that course and completely fell in love with oral history, and I've now remembered that actually it wasn't the oral history reader that kind of snarky little note was in, because that literally came out as we started that course. But it felt like that there was a really small group of us doing that course, and it was a really it was wonderful. It felt like I kind of had this moment where this is what being a postgraduate student must be like, because we just sort of sat there and discussed, and everyone had read the same pieces and everyone felt really invested in it, and I don't know, it felt like a different kind of discussion, and it felt very present, and it felt very important, and it just gelled with me. So that was the real kind of that was my kind of not eureka moment, but that was where I really connected, I suppose, with that as a discipline and a kind of way of thinking about the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And that HIV/AIDS crisis is something that you've definitely focused on in your work after university as well. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your work that you've done there and what you've done with that?
Yeah, certainly. So I did the dissertation, which was about gay men's, I don't know, politics or like politicization during the AIDS crisis. Not a very good dissertation, but interested me, and was very, very hooked at that point. And I did. I had applied to do a master's. Well, actually, I applied to do, not realizing that actually getting into a master's course at that time certainly was actually not that hard, because there are a number of reasons why. Basically, they want your money. But as Stella Moss, who very kindly wrote me references, will tell you, I applied for a lot of master's courses, but did so right at the kind of the early stage where you haven't quite finished your undergrad yet. And so I'd applied with the far right idea, and was very fortunate that Lucy Delap at Cambridge said, that she would be happy to supervise that, and I arrived at Cambridge, and that's when that article came out. So I kind of arrived and was like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but I've kind of finished that already. Can I do something else?" And that was fine, because you would expect, as I'm sure you're finding out now doing your own work, that your thinking changes, and that's a really good thing. Like, you really want that to be the case.
And the more you think, the more it changes. So.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a fascinating kind of journey, and to kind of be able to map that, I think, is really exciting and engaging, and it's a really good thing to see. But certainly that was the case for me. I arrived and was like, I've completely changed my thinking about what I want to do and why I want to be here. And by that point, I'd done this course and was really invested in the history of HIV in Britain, and could see there was more to do. And so basically, I needed a new dissertation topic, and I kind of expected it would be something on HIV. And it just so happened that one week we had done a week on religious history, or rather like the history of Christianity, religiosity in Britain. Wasn't about contemporary wasn't about kind of very modern Christianity or religion at all. It was very much kind of classic Davidoff and Hall, family fortunes, respectability, morality stuff. But I really enjoyed that and really engaged with that, and married these two interests, because I, in the process of kind of that moment of thinking I'm really interested in religion and really interested in HIV, discovered there hadn't been that much done on the kind of the collision between those two fields and those two kind of things. And so I ended up writing my master's dissertation, which was on the Church of England's response to the AIDS crisis, and that kind of interest in religious thinking about HIV and religious approaches to people living with HIV has remained an interest for quite a long time. My PhD was about AIDS activism much more generally in Britain, but there were religious aspects to that. So really the kind of moment of master's project study was what kind of cemented the kind of research, my kind of research profile, I think, or my research like trajectory, if you like, in terms of really thinking about the kind of social and political and crucially the cultural history of AIDS in Britain, which I think is really what my research has broadly been about ever since.
Wow, it's fascinating. I know that we could do a whole podcast episode just on that, absolutely, because it is fascinating. But oral history, what is it? In a kind of brief definition, it might be difficult to do, but what is oral history? What does it encompass?
Yeah, in a way it's very easy to answer, and in a way it's very difficult to answer, because what we know what oral history kind of looks like, and we get a sense of what oral history is, but oral history and oral historians are really they're not keen to do this, but they often eschew a kind of definitional boundary, mostly because oral historians have tended to be quite radical and quite I don't know how to phrase it, but they have avoided being kind of bound by definition. But there are things we can say about what an oral history is. To my mind, an oral history is a recorded interview with the express purpose of that interview being to create a new historical source, that being the interview. So that interview becomes part of the historical record, becomes part of the archival record, and usually it's about people's lives, right? It's normally not always a life history interview. The vast majority, I think, of oral history interviews would be a life history interview, although increasingly, people, students, community projects are doing maybe more targeted interviews that are about, a campaign, or could be anything really in that regard. But crucially, it's very different to, say, a vox pop or an interview about something that's happened 10 minutes ago. Right. There's an aspect of reflection that's really and crucially historical reflection that's really important to kind of defining, I suppose, what an oral history interview is. But for me, it is that what really makes an oral history interview distinct is that point about the kind of conscious creation of a new source. I think that's kind of, and there were plenty of examples, I'm sure, where that really doesn't fit quite so well. But that really, in terms of thinking about, you know, what might not be an oral history interview, often I think what the kind of defining feature of that which we would say is an oral history interview is that sense of creating a new source, doing something that kind of fills an archival gap or that tells us something new. The real kind of historiographical and actually political impetus for that comes from thinking about or comes from historians who reflected on whose voices are not in the traditional whose voices are not in the traditional archive, right? People who've been left out. So the move for this in Britain, at least, comes from the history workshop movement, from people like Raphael Samuel, Sally Alexander, and others who really champion unheard voices across a number of disciplines. Oral history is one in their kind of methodological arsenal, but at that point it's a really fruitful thing to do because a kind of a marriage of convenient circumstances, people who had the capacity to teach students this methodology, the fact that tape recorders were becoming much more affordable, accessible, portable, meant you could go and do these interviews. And this I should say, this is going on in the kind of late 70s, or rather the early 70s onwards. You know, this is a really interesting political moment, but it's also, when you think about generationally, you know, a lot of kind of late 19th century political actors, you know, maybe are just about around still, and there's this kind of sense of, and certainly early 20th century, you know, radicals from the labour movement, radicals from the trade union movement. These are the people, in part, who those early pioneers were really keen to make sure their voices were kind of accessed. And actually not just those kind of prominent radicals, really people like Raphael Samuel and his students at Ruskin College, Oxford, were really keen to make sure that, like, quote unquote ordinary workers' voices were preserved. So you would get people, I don't know how much you know about the History Workshop movement, Zach, but the History Workshop is, you know, part of the kind of rationale is that Raphael Samuel would have student workers at Ruskin College, at the Trade Union College, and so you'd have people come, they would be, let's say, a railwayman, and Samuel would then encourage these people to go and do their research into their own kind of working histories and working practices. So they would go and interview, you know, older people who'd worked on the railways or built them or whatever. So you get that kind of you know, voice on the ground. So it's not the managerial level paper archive stuff, and nor is it just the prominent trade union leader stuff. It's something more kind of grassroots. That's the really key point, and that has largely maintained that emphasis on grassroots history.
Yeah, so it is very much it's kind of disruptive by nature almost, where it takes those ordinary voices that you might not normally hear, might not normally get listened to in a way as well, and brings those into the public consciousness in a way.
Yeah, and I like that description of it being disruptive, and there will be lots of oral historians who have made that same noise that I made when you said that. It starts off being purposefully the case that it's trying to disrupt the archive and just trying to disrupt the historical kind of landscape, I suppose, recognizing not only that there were voices that were being left out, but there's almost conscious but certainly unconscious bias and lack of balance to what's in the archive, what's being written about. So the kind of the challenge from oral history and others, you know, the challenge from other disciplines as well, was to disrupt that and to change it. And it's why oral history as a methodology marries so well with approaches like queer history, queer theory, post-colonial studies, diaspora studies, and increasingly now actually disability studies, that are all trying to do the same thing, that are trying to make sure that subaltern voices are heard, and noting those kind of that lack of balance in the historical record and in historical practice. That's another real challenge of all the disciplines is to get historians to look at what they're doing as practitioners, that they're not neutral in that process of history making, that they have a real conscious and subconscious part to play in that process, and actually reflecting on that is vital, and that's I think a really disruptive and productive prompt from oral history in dialogue with many of those other kind of disciplinary contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think bringing those voices to the fore is what kind of makes oral history very engaging and very interactive in a sense as well. What do you think it is about oral history in general that makes it so engaging, so intimate in a way and personal? What is it about oral history that connects so well with the wider public?
Yeah, I think it is the orality of it.
Right.
I think it's the voice. I think it's the fact you can hear these voices in real time. I mean, the fact the British Library has a recording of Florence Nightingale in its collection, which is just remarkable. We don't even have any oral record of George Orwell's voice, but we have Florence Nightingale's.
Wow,
this is incredible, and it does do something to connect you to that figure, whether it's someone famous like Florence Nightingale, or whether it's somebody much more anonymous and who don't have a real sense of their kind of historical, quote unquote significance. And there's been a lot written about orality and the importance of orality over, say, the fact over transcription. The fact that listening to these recordings tends to be much more powerful and actually more analytically salient than just reading the transcript. You get a lot more from it. So I think there's something quite academic in this answer that speaks much more clearly to your question, which was much more about kind of public audience and public consumption. But the point remains that it's the fact that there's something oral with an A that kind of punches through the much more, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, the much more kind of there's something about the orality of an oral history interview that literally speaks to the person listening to it. Like the fact that happens in real time in a way that reading a transcript doesn't. I suppose there is something about the fact that it is in real time. If you're reading a transcript, it's not quite in the same temporal sense. Whereas if you're reading a diary entry or if you're reading a letter, you are reading that more in the same kind of time frame as it was being. I'm thinking on my feet here, Zach, but I do think there's something about the fact that you're actually listening to that as someone is speaking it, that really connects. And we know this from public history settings that museum exhibition goers are more engaged by being able to hear people's oral history clips than just reading a section that's been painted onto the wall or that's been transcribed for them into a booklet. There is something really powerful about the fact you can hear this person speaking, and a lot of it is of course as well about the fact that the voice of somebody carries with them just a lot of emotion, a lot of emphasis, accent, all that kind of stuff that you just don't get from however good the transcript is. You just don't get it in the same way. I mean, there's a clip that I was listening to recently, which was a recording of a woman interviewed by Graham Smith, and she had, during the Second World War, had to flee from Ukraine to Britain, and she settles in Bradford, as many Ukrainian forced migrants from that period did. And the transcript is very interesting, but the fact that her voice is just a really interesting mix of Ukrainian accent and Bradford is fascinating, and you like. There's nothing much to say about that, but it's powerful, and it connects with people listening to it, because you get so much more of a sense of this person as an individual by hearing their actual voice. So there's tons more you could say about why, why it is that it's so engaging, why it's so powerful. But the fact it's, the fact that it connects and it speaks and it's someone's actual voice is the main part of that answer, I think. But one caveat I would say, just to end this very long answer to your very simple question, is I mentioned earlier that disability studies is I think prompting a lot of, or maybe it should be prompting more of this, but it is prompting, at least in my thinking, a lot of questions about the answer I've just given you, about the aoral, and about the power of the spoken word, because there are thinkers like Teresa Hilliard who's been writing about disabled, or her PhD was about people with cerebral palsy who had varying levels of ability to verbally communicate. And so there's a real challenge for oral historians about how do we do oral history with people who have differing abilities to communicate verbally or to hear orally, and the answers to those questions are going to come from disabled scholars and disability scholars, but it's a challenge we need to be really ready for, because there are clearly ways to do this, and to read people like Teresa Hilliard and others, you see this, but we're being really slow to take this up, and I think it's going to be something that we really need to engage with much more seriously and much more fully, because otherwise we risk, the orality of the interview clearly is part and parcel of the identity of this method and approach, but it can't be everything, I don't think, because otherwise we're really losing out on a really vast and really rich array of experiences, and we would do that at our detriment, I think.
Absolutely. It's as well with oral history, it's almost as if there are those elements of human existence that are best communicated in a oral way, almost, and we can connect with people. I guess that's why it's so prominent in Holocaust studies and the history of the Holocaust, or oral history interviews of that, is we can connect with those people not because we've experienced the same thing, but by the mere fact that we are both humans. There are those elements that almost transcend the experience that we might not have shared, but as humans we can connect on a different level as we're hearing them speak, and we're hearing their stories, and we're collecting them almost.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it speaks, that what you've just said speaks really nicely to a large body of thinking within oral history literature, which is what we're thinking there about is how can you engage with people who've had different experiences to you. There's a large amount of thinking about the kind of insider-outsider dynamic,
right,
and how much does it impact the interview that comes out of this conversation if the interviewer is to some extent an insider. So Amy Tooth Murphy at Royal Holloway has written really, really beautifully about this, about two projects. One where she was an insider. She, as a lesbian researcher, was doing interviews with lesbian women, and she felt that she got a lot out of that because her interviewees could really identify with her, and felt they could trust her, versus a project she ran as a kind of manager, I think, with survivors of the Bethnal Green tube disaster, and she did not experience that disaster, but is able to point out that actually there's, as you've just said, that one, that you can really engage and sympathise just as a human. That's something quite, that's something that we're capable of doing in that context as well as more broadly. But that as an outsider, she was able to actually get quite a lot of information, because in those insider moments, you can often lose some information, or you can lose some of the content, because there's an assumption between the interviewer and the interviewee, right? You can be like, oh, you know about that, and you know this. Whereas if you're an outsider, it's necessary for your interviewee to really spell things out that they might think are really self-explanatory. and I realise that's not what you actually just said or asked about, but I think that's important to say, that in those moments where you feel like actually I'm not really engaging so closely or so kind of concretely in the way that, you know, in other moments you find that real kind of you really gel with your interviewee and really have that sense of empathy and of mutual understanding. They can still be really profitable, and actually for both parties they can be. But the point you actually made about that kind of the power of the voice to really speak to you is really true. And I think what's really telling is that, you know, and this again is something worth saying, especially to people who think that maybe oral histories are a post-war or kind of late 20th century historical creation as a source. Of course, not true. You know, Hansard is an oral history source. It's a spoken word. Maybe it's not an oral history source, but it's a spoken word source. And there is something very powerful about early records of people's spoken words. I'm thinking of I don't know if you've read Helen McCarthy's book on working mothers, but that one of the early chapters of that book opens with an account drawn from a parliamentary hearing or a parliamentary inquiry, I think, about sweated labour, and about has women who came to I think the House of Lords to give their testimony. And so it's obviously we don't have the voice themselves, but you know, some of that spoken word, some of that kind of some of that same oral quality does come through, maybe because it's not expected, and it cuts through the kind of very formal parliamentary language that's everywhere else in that kind of source work. But there are what I'm trying to say here is there are much earlier moments where we do have that powerful spoken voice kind of really appearing very strongly and doing exactly what you've just said about kind of I mean, in that case, across, you know, 100 and some years, really connecting with readers and with clearly with McCarthy as well. It's a really useful source. So that I think makes very clear in that quite alien context, alien in terms of what we're talking about, you know, just how powerful the spoken word can be.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Present History Podcast. But this was only half the conversation. So check back next week where we discuss through the practicalities of conducting an oral history interview and the impact that oral history can have on history as a whole, its future, and even the education system. You do not want to miss that. So in the meantime, make sure to follow us on all social medias to keep up to date with everything that we do. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating on Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you are listening to this. And we'll see you next time on the Present History Podcast.